I think the tide has turned. I've written 4 books now about Bigfoot, and
He almost didn't make the trip. David had driven out to remote wilderness areas dozens of times over the years.
each one of my books,
He had followed up on reports that turned out to be nothing misidentified tracks, exaggerated sightings, the kind of stories that sound compelling over the phone and dissolve completely when you're standing in the actual location. He almost filed this one the same way. What stopped him was a single detail. The ranger on the other end of the call, a man who had worked the same Oregon wilderness corridor for 11 years, refused to describe what he had on his trail camera. Not couldn't, wouldn't. "You need to see it yourself," he said. "I don't want to color what you see." That kind of caution, from that kind of source, meant something. So David made the trip. What he found over the next 4 days in Oregon's Cascade Ridge wilderness would take him longer to process than any case he had worked in 3 decades of law enforcement. Not because the evidence was dramatic, because it was careful, methodical, almost deliberate, as if whatever left it understood exactly what it was doing. You need to understand who David is before any of this evidence means anything, because the kind of person collecting the evidence determines what the evidence is worth. David spent the better part of 30 years in law enforcement, missing persons, homicide, the kind of investigative work that teaches you very quickly that what you want to be true and what the physical record actually shows are frequently 2 entirely different things. Cases that looked solved weren't. Witnesses who seemed credible weren't. Evidence that appeared obvious pointed somewhere unexpected. That experience builds a particular kind of discipline, one that is genuinely difficult to maintain, because the human mind wants resolution. It wants to close the file. It wants the explanation that makes the discomfort go away. David's career trained him to resist that impulse, to sit with unresolved evidence and let it tell him what it showed, rather than telling it what he needed it to mean. When he eventually turned that discipline toward unexplained wilderness observations, he brought the same approach. He wasn't a believer looking for confirmation. For years, he was closer to the opposite, actively looking for the conventional explanation, the misidentification, the hoax. When he found those explanations, he documented them as such and moved on. When he couldn't find them, he documented that too. Over time, the cases where conventional explanation failed began accumulating. The same physical characteristics appearing across different states, documented by different people in different years. A pattern that resisted the pressure he applied to it. By September 2019, he had been doing this work long enough to know the difference between interesting and significant. What he found at Cascade Ridge would turn out to be the second kind. He just didn't know that yet when he pulled onto the dirt road leading into the wilderness corridor on the morning of September 20th, late August 2019. The call came from a ranger David had spoken with before, someone he trusted, because the man had never once brought him something that wasn't worth the drive. The ranger's name for this documentation is McCovey. 11 years working the same Cascade Ridge territory. The kind of field experience that means he knows the difference between what belongs there and what doesn't. Over the previous several weeks, McCovey had been tracking a quiet accumulation of anomalies, creek crossings with activity outside the patterns he knew by heart, game cameras triggering at intervals that didn't match any documented wildlife behavior in that corridor, physical disturbances in locations where large animals simply don't move. None of it was individually conclusive, but McCovey had spent 11 years learning what his territory looked like when it was operating normally. And for several weeks, small things had been wrong. What he wouldn't describe over the phone was what he had on his trail camera. David pressed him on it. "Just give me the basics. Tell me what you're looking at." McCovey said no. He said he'd reviewed the footage enough times that he was no longer certain what he was seeing, and he didn't want that uncertainty transferred to David before David had a chance to form his own first impression. An 11-year field veteran, uncertain about what he was looking at on his own camera, in his own territory. David packed his equipment that evening. They started at the creek drainage. Old-growth timber, thick canopy, ground that stayed soft and damp near the water, the kind of terrain that holds impressions well. David had worked enough field locations to read a landscape quickly, and this one had the quality of a place that didn't get much human traffic, the kind of quiet that accumulates over time. McCovey led them upstream along the bank without saying much. He had learned not to point things out before people saw them for themselves. David saw it first, a single print in the mud. He crouched down without saying anything, looked at it for a long moment, called the forensic technician over quietly. The print measured 18.5 inches in length, 8.5 inches across. He didn't say what he was thinking. He stood up and looked upstream. There were more. 47 individual impressions extending over 100 feet along the creek bank, a complete trackway, preserved in the soft ground near the water, laid down by something that had walked this route at a pace that left consistent, deliberate, evenly spaced prints. The team didn't speak much. They worked. Webb began the documentation process, photographing each impression before anything was touched, logging GPS coordinates, preparing plaster for the casting process. David walked the length of the trackway slowly, studying the stride spacing, 68 inches between footfalls, a walking pace, even unhurried. Whatever had made these prints wasn't running, wasn't startled. It was simply moving through a familiar corridor the way something moves when it has no reason to be afraid. That detail stayed with him. Later, when Webb had finished the initial documentation and they were able to examine the casts more closely, the forensic technician pointed to something in one of the better preserved impressions: dermal ridges. The fine surface pattern embedded in the impression, the biological equivalent of fingerprints on the sole of the foot, formed by living skin under genuine pressure. David looked at it for a long time. Dermal ridges don't appear in manufactured tracks. They don't appear in bear prints. They form in living tissue under real weight. He didn't say much. He asked Webb to photograph it from every possible angle. David would say later that the prints weren't what unsettled him. It was the stride, 68 inches at walking pace. Something that size, moving without urgency, through a drainage it clearly knew well. He had spent 30 years learning how to read what a scene was telling him. This one was telling him something he wasn't ready to name yet. 200 yards upstream from the trackway, McCovey stopped walking. He didn't point. He just stopped and waited for the team to see it. The structure stood 9 feet across, branches broken from surrounding trees and woven together into a dome, the breaks occurring consistently between 8 and 10 feet above the ground, the material interlaced with a logic that was immediately apparent. It wasn't random. It wasn't wind damage. Something had looked at this space, understood what shelter required, and built it. David walked around the outside slowly before going in. The breaks in the surrounding trees were deliberate, consistent heights, the kind of consistency that comes from something working methodically, not from a storm moving through randomly. Inside, compressed vegetation formed a deep central depression, the kind of compression that comes from repeated use, from something large returning to the same resting place over weeks or months. He stood in the center of the structure for a while without speaking. McCovey, standing outside, said quietly, "It was here before I found the prints. I found the shelter first." David looked at the compression in the vegetation, at the careful architecture of the walls around him. Whatever had built this wasn't passing through, it was living here. The team recovered 37 hair samples from the broken branches throughout the structure, each photographed in place before collection, GPS logged, sealed in forensic containers. Some of the specimens had follicles still attached, root material, the kind that makes DNA extraction viable. David documented everything without conclusion. That was the discipline. Observe, collect, document. Don't decide what it means before the evidence tells you. But he would admit later that standing inside that structure was the moment the case changed for him, not because he had an answer, because he realized, for the first time, that he was genuinely uncertain what the answer was going to be. 2 days into the investigation, early morning survey of a second location, 1.3 miles from the initial site. Different terrain here, quieter. A small seep spring, keeping a patch of ground consistently soft in an otherwise dry section of forest. At 6:47 a.m., David found biological material on a fallen log. Fresh scat. 3 inches across, 14 inches long. Still fresh enough to estimate it had been deposited within the previous 12 hours. He crouched beside it for a long moment, said nothing. The size was beyond anything the region's documented wildlife would produce under normal conditions. The composition told its own story: partially digested plant matter, seeds, and small bone fragments from consumed prey. An omnivore, something that moved between plant and animal food sources easily. He photographed it from multiple angles before anyone else moved closer. Then he stood up and looked around the surrounding area. 30 yards away, near the spring, Webb called out quietly, the way the team had learned to communicate over the previous 2 days. David walked over. In the soft mud beside the water was a handprint, 11 inches across. 5 distinct digits, individually defined. and a thumb set at the angle of a thumb designed for grasping. He crouched beside it and stayed there for a while. Bear paws carry 5 digits. That comparison comes up, and it has to be acknowledged. But bear anatomy doesn't produce this. No opposable thumb. The proportions are wrong, the spread is wrong. The structure in this impression was primate hand anatomy built for grasping and manipulation at a scale that no documented primate in North America approaches. Webb began casting immediately. David documented the surrounding area without disturbing anything. He would say later that the handprint was different from the footprints. The footprints showed something moving. The handprint showed something that had stopped, that had pressed its hand into the mud beside a spring and held it there long enough to leave a clear impression. He didn't know why. He documented it and didn't speculate. By the time they were preparing to leave Cascade Ridge on September 23rd, the evidence package included plaster casts of footprints and the handprint, 37 hair samples with intact follicles, fresh biological material, soil samples, over 400 GPS-tagged photographs, and 11 seconds of trail camera footage that matched no known wildlife profile in the region. Everything shipped to independent laboratories under blind submission. The facilities received biological material from an unknown source. No subject matter framing, just samples requiring identification. Before the laboratory results came back, David worked through every alternative explanation the way he had always worked through alternative explanations, seriously and without a predetermined destination. The footprints. Could someone have fabricated them? Yes, it happens. But fabrication leaves specific forensic indicators, mechanical compression that differs from genuine weight-bearing, edge artifacts from pressed material, soil disturbance from the construction process. None of those were present. The dermal ridge detail, present in multiple impressions, cannot be replicated by pressing a shaped object into mud. That detail alone eliminated fabrication as a credible explanation. Could the prints belong to a known animal? Bears on hind legs produce impressions that can superficially resemble bipedal tracks. But bear anatomy is identifiable under examination: claw marks, specific pad geometry, proportions inconsistent with 5-digit foot structure. These casts showed 5 clearly defined toes, no claw evidence, and pressure distribution consistent with sustained bipedal locomotion. That wasn't bear anatomy. The stride spacing 68 inches at walking pace indicated leg length corresponding to height considerably above 8 feet. People of exceptional stature are medically documented, their proportions measured. These patterns didn't correspond to those proportions. Could the samples be contaminated? David had thought about this before the collection even began, because he knew it would be the first challenge raised. Even worst-case contamination, direct, unprotected contact with samples leaves an identifiable forensic signature. The contaminating person's maternal DNA appears on one side of the genetic profile, their paternal DNA on the other. That is what contamination looks like. These samples showed neither. No maternal match, no paternal identification, no human contributor detected in either direction. He ran through every explanation he could construct. None of them held when he pressed on them. That left him with the physical record as it stood, and the laboratory results that were coming. There is a specific experience that investigators describe, and it doesn't happen often. It's the moment when you've tested every explanation available to you honestly, without shortcuts, and none of them account for what you're looking at. It doesn't feel like discovery. It feels like the ground shifting slightly under you. David had felt it twice before in 30 years. Both times, it meant the case was something different than it appeared. He felt it again, waiting for the laboratory to call. The results arrived in November 2019. The laboratory called before sending the written report. David said later that he knew from the tone of the call before the scientist finished the first sentence. The DNA extracted from the hair samples and biological material showed clear primate markers, sequences placing the samples within the great ape family. Then the scientist said something David wasn't prepared for. They didn't match anything in the database. He asked the scientist to say that again. The GenBank database contains genetic information from every cataloged organism on Earth, over 34 trillion base pairs, every documented primate lineage, every known great ape species. The sequences from the Cascade Ridge samples carried great ape family markers and matched none of it. Not human, not gorilla, not chimpanzee, not any primate with a reference sequence on record. David sat with that for a moment. He asked about contamination. The scientists told him they had run full contamination protocols specifically. Human DNA had been tested for separately. The results held. He asked what it meant. The scientists said they weren't prepared to characterize it further. They had reported what the analysis showed. What it meant was outside what they were willing to speculate on in a laboratory context. David hung up and sat quietly for a while. A second independent laboratory was then engaged. Different facility, different equipment, different methodology. When results are anomalous, independent verification using separate methods is standard procedure. You don't accept unexpected findings from a single source. The second analysis returned the same finding. Primate markers, great ape family, no catalog species. He had spent his career learning that evidence doesn't lie. Evidence shows what it shows. The question is whether you're willing to follow it somewhere uncomfortable. Throughout the morning of September 22nd, videographer Tom Richards had been running camera equipment, continuously documenting evidence collection and maintaining coverage of the surrounding forest. At approximately 7:45 a.m., Richards went still beside his equipment. He signaled David without speaking. Small motion, eyes upslope, 100 yards up through the timber. Something was moving. The team kept working. David had made that call immediately. Don't acknowledge it. Don't change behavior. Continue what you're doing. 30 years of field experience. When you're being observed, you maintain normal patterns. The movement continued for several minutes. Something large, maintaining position in the upslope timber, shifting when the team was occupied, still when anyone's attention drifted in that direction. It was watching them. That was the only word David could find for it afterward. Not wandering through, watching. When the footage was reviewed, Richard's telephoto lenses had captured approximately 4 minutes of a large bipedal figure moving through the upslope forest. Measured against surrounding trees of known diameter, its proportions were consistent with the stride measurements from the creek. The footage went to an independent forensic video analysis team for frame-by-frame examination. They found no indicators of costume construction, no mechanical support signatures, no gait anomalies consistent with human performance inside a fabricated suit. They did not conclude what the figure is. They concluded what it demonstrably is not. David watched the footage multiple times after receiving the forensic report. He kept coming back to the behavior pattern, the way it moved only when attention was elsewhere, the way it used cover deliberately, the consistency of its positioning relative to the team below. Whatever was in that footage understood what observation was. That thought stayed with him longer than any of the physical evidence. Following compilation of the full evidence package, David made systematic attempts to engage mainstream scientific review. UC Davis declined. UC Berkeley declined. Multiple additional institutions declined most before reviewing collection protocols or examining the laboratory results already obtained. The refusals weren't based on evidence quality. They were based on subject matter. David had expected resistance. What surprised him was how complete it was, how quickly institutions declined, how little interest they showed in the methodology, how automatic the avoidance was. He understood why, in a structural sense. Research institutions operate within ecosystems of funding and professional reputation, where association with controversial subjects carries real consequences. The rational, institutional response to that pressure is avoidance, regardless of what the evidence actually shows. But understanding why the wall exists doesn't make the wall less significant. Physical evidence that cannot enter formal review cannot be formally resolved. It sits permanently between collection and conclusion, not because it fails scientific standards, but because the subject matter triggers avoidance before standards are ever applied. Field rangers across multiple agencies had described informal guidance to avoid logging unusual observations officially. Wildlife professionals in separate regions described the same pattern. The observations don't stop occurring. They simply stop being recorded. David had spent his career working within institutions. He understood how they operated. He also understood what it meant when documented evidence had nowhere to go. The trail camera at Cascade Ridge still runs. Deer, elk, black bears moving through their established corridors. The baseline unchanged. The wilderness operating on its documented schedule. The 11 seconds from September 22, 2019 remain the only footage in 3 years of continuous operation that didn't fit. The only activation that has never been explained. David followed the physical record at Cascade Ridge the way he had followed physical records his entire career. Methodically, without predetermined destinations, testing every alternative seriously and honestly before allowing himself to consider what remained when the alternatives fail. What remained was this: footprints with forensic detail inconsistent with any cataloged North American species. Genetic material matching nothing in the most comprehensive biological database on Earth. A structure built with deliberate architectural logic by something that returned to it repeatedly. 4 minutes of footage showing bipedal movement that forensic analysis could not attribute to fabrication. And something on a hillside that watched a team of investigators work for the better part of an hour, moving only when they weren't looking, holding still when they were. Understanding the difference, David doesn't make a claim about what any of it proves. He spent too long in law enforcement to reach conclusions the evidence doesn't fully support. What he will say is this: he went to Cascade Ridge as a skeptic. He left as something harder to name, not a believer in the popular sense, something quieter than that. A man who followed evidence somewhere he hadn't expected to go, and found that the questions waiting at the end of that road were larger than the answers he brought with him. The documentation continues, carefully, without drama, one piece of physical evidence at a time, because whatever moved through that wilderness on a September morning, patterned enough to repeat, aware enough to watch, careful enough to remain just beyond complete identification, is still out there, and it deserves an answer built on evidence. Note silence.